Darkness Dwells is brought to you by Crystal Lake Publishing. Go to crystallakepub.com and go check out what they've got going. They've been publishing since 2012, and they are only getting bigger. They have published the likes of Ramsey Campbell, Mercedes Yardley, and Clive Barker, amongst many more. We're also supported by audible.com. Go to audibletrial.com/darknessdwells and pick out any book that you want when you sign up for a free trial membership. And that trial lasts for 1 month and you get any book you want for free. So go and check that out. Dwells Podcast, episode 112. I am Jason White.
I am Michael Schutz.
And this week, real quick, we talk with Gwendolyn Kiste, and we discuss the 2017 French horror film Raw. So please stick around. So, Michael, how are you doing?
I am doing pretty well. I've been reading a lot lately. I'm doing something I never do. I'm reading two things at once. I am reading, boy, I tell you, this was recommended to me when I wanted to read disturbing fiction. J.F. Gonzalez's Survivor.
Oh,
holy crap. This is almost too much for me.
Really?
And that's saying a lot.
That is saying a lot.
Almost. But yeah. Oh boy. I got to the first Debbie part last night. Yay, boy, that was harder than Ketchum's The Girl Next Door. I gotta say, that was rough. So yeah, so headed for 5 stars for me. And I am also reading our guest Gwendolyn Kiste's collection, "And Her Smile Will Untether the Universe." And let me tell you, these short stories are fantastic.
They really are, aren't they?
Wow. They're just, makes me want to, I either have to quit writing altogether or really up my game. I mean, yeah. I can't do the same thing that I've always been doing. I tell you, when this is, something like that is out there, game changer.
Yeah, she is going places. And I'm so happy that she agreed to come on the show and talk with us, because I was reading the Rust Maidens when I decided, you know what, I'm going to contact her, see if she'll be on the show. And that book just blew me away. And then I went right into her collection there, and it's just phenomenal. Phenomenal writing.
It is. Wow. Reminds me a lot of Kelly Link, who I was recently turned on to. And she's another one, just very fantastic. They write as if they went to some of the same classes. They're sort of, it's almost like a new school. Like, I don't know, you'd have to come up with a new name for this type of fiction, like the new wave, the new horror wave. But yeah. Wow.
You know, Kelly Link is still an author I have yet to read. I've had her suggested that I read many times. Ben Eads suggested I read her. Yes. You did, and a few others. I have her collection, but I've yet to read it. It's like, dude, just read the goddamn thing.
Which one? Yes, which one do you have?
I have Get in Trouble.
Oh, that was my first one. That's really good. The New Boyfriend. That just, the imagination around that one is just jaw-dropping. And then I was reading Magic for Beginners. She has a story in there called Catskin. Man, that's just, she's just thinking on a whole different plane than what anybody else is thinking. Who thinks like that? It's amazing. Brilliant.
That's awesome. I'm looking forward to reading her because I think one reason why I've held it off, and this is something I do, and I don't know why, but just say I have a favorite author, and they come out with a new book. I'm all excited. I get the book, and then I don't read it. Why don't I read it? Because I want to savor it. I don't want it to... I don't want it to me have read it and then be like, oh, well, now there's nothing like by this person anymore. And when I'm thinking of Kelly Link, I know that I'm going to love it. And I think that's one reason why. And also, I want to avoid the disappointment if I don't like it, but I'm pretty sure I will.
I can't see you not liking it.
I'm pretty certain I will.
Nice.
I might read it soon.
And that's the great thing with collections and anthologies, of course. But if one or two stories don't hit, you'll still find one or two stories that do. And
well, that happens.
I find that's true.
I'll read anthologies, and I won't remember the author name, but I'll remember it if I come across that story in their own collection when I get to it, and I'll be like, oh, I read this. Where did I read this? And then I'll go look, and sometimes I find it, sometimes I don't. But yeah, I really need to remember those, like everyone, because sometimes you just like, oh, who's this? Oh, okay, it's Kelly Link, cool. And then you read it, and then a couple years later, it's gone. You just you can't remember. You can't put two and two together anymore.
Yeah,
maybe that's
I need to. 3 years ago, I intended to start a little diary, a journal about everything that I watched and read, and just one or two lines about what it was, so that I would remember and I could look through. But I forgot to keep up with it.
That's something I want to do as well, because I want to remember these things, and it's fun just to look back and see what you were reading this day last year. You know what I mean?
It is.
Yeah,
it really is.
All right, so this episode, as we were discussing, Michael and I, we both had a great conversation with Gwendolyn Kiste, and we also talked about the 2017 French film, Raw. So I think, I don't know about you, but I think I'm ready to jump into this one.
Oh, let's do it. I've been ready. First time I saw this movie was right after it came out, and so I was so happy when you came to me and said, "Oh, let's do this movie." So, yeah.
Welcome back. This week, as promised, we have one hell of an awesome guest. I'm happy to welcome Gwendolyn Kiste. She is the author of the Bram Stoker Award-nominated fiction collection, And Her Smile Will Untether the Universe. I love that title, by the way. And that's from Journal Stone. The dark fantasy novella, Pretty Marys, All in a Row, from Broken Eye Books, and her debut novel, The Rust Maidens, from Trepidatio Publishing. Her short fiction has appeared in Nightmare Magazine, Shimmer, Black Static, Daily Science Fiction, Interzone, Lamplight, and Three-Lobed Burning Eye, as well as Flame Tree Publishing's Chilling Horror Short Stories Anthology, among many others. She is a native of Ohio and currently resides on an abandoned farm outside of Pittsburgh with her husband, 2 cats, and not nearly enough ghosts. Welcome to the show, Gwendolyn.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Oh,
We're glad to have.
Before we get into anything, I was really interested asking you about that abandoned horse farm that you live in. How did you come to live in an abandoned horse farm?
My husband had bought it before he and I were dating, so it's all his fault. But the person who owned it before us had a bunch of horses. That was like their living, I believe. And there's just like horse fences and horse troughs and like the whole deal. And yet no horses, because we don't have horses. So that's why we say it's an abandoned horse farm. Even though my husband always says it's not really abandoned, like we live here. But I'm like, no horses live here.
Unless,
it sounds really spooky when you say it like that.
Yeah, I was thinking it's not really abandoned unless you guys are actually ghosts too.
Ooh,
This just got weird.
Gold.
Yeah. Are there any ghosts?
Not a ton. I've had a couple like weird things happen, but nothing that sticks around. So I will say no for the moment, but maybe. There's like we have a ghost in the house that we call third cat because we have two cats, and then sometimes we see something that looks like a cat that isn't here, like we don't have a third cat. And then what was really weird is we talked to somebody else who's like local to this area, and he was like, "Oh yeah, that's a thing. Like just cats that aren't really there in this area." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." Like that's really scary and weird, but there's cats.
I'm so jealous. Oh, I want something like that in my apartment.
Michael would love ghost cats. Yes.
Ghost cats. Yes, definitely. Any kind of ghost though. I've never had any experiences, and that's terrible. I'm sorry, I'm derailing our discussion now, but I need to have a haunted experience.
You should seek this out, Michael.
I'm gonna have to come and visit. Can you guys put me up in the hayloft there?
We will do our best. We will make accommodations.
Okay.
I can't help but think that there's a story in this somewhere. So I was reading an interview with you. It was in Black Static magazine where you discussed your childhood. Now, you mentioned locking yourself away and reading books on the weekends and over the summer break. Now, this is something I know I can relate to, and Michael probably can too. Now, I was wondering, what were those books you read back then, and which ones made you want to become a writer?
A lot of them were horror fiction anthologies, like horror short fiction anthologies, and it was like a lot of sometimes they were more classic stories. So, Ambrose Bierce, Edgar Allan Poe, and then other ones were, I read Stephen King when I was fairly young. And so it was a lot of the ones I feel many of us came to horror, reading those early stories that many of us discovered when we were young. So those are the ones that immediately come to mind.
And I've heard that you're also an independent filmmaker.
Not anymore. Go on.
Good experiences then.
Yeah, right. I was a terrible filmmaker. I was not a very good filmmaker. I feel like I'm much better as a fiction writer. I loved the screenwriting part of it, but then actually directing actors, I would just get very frustrated, which I also get frustrated at my characters now, but they don't get as, angry at me. So, yeah, I always said, and this was something when I really kind of dedicated myself again to fiction writing, because I did fiction writing when I was younger and then went into screenwriting for a number of years and then came back to fiction writing. I felt that because I didn't have that much money for the filmmaking, that many things that I wanted to do felt at times very much out of my reach. Whereas as a writer, we all pretty much at least, have the most basic tools that any successful writer would have now. I have a laptop. So it's like, I feel at times that's what Stephen King probably writes on. So it's like, I felt that I could have a better chance at seeing what I could do rather than with filmmaking that I always felt like, I could never quite get to where I wanted to. Now, maybe if I'd been a more creative filmmaker, I wouldn't have felt that way. It could just be because I was a really bad filmmaker. So,
have you thought about pursuing screenplays anymore?
No, I really haven't. It's so funny because I make it sound like it was all bad, and it wasn't. That was how my husband and I met. He did special effects and also did acting, and then I did acting and screenwriting and directing. So and I made a lot of friends doing it, and it was actually a good experience for the time. It's just my husband and I happened to burn out on it at exactly the same time, and we were kind of secretly not wanting to say anything to the other one because we were worried. And then one day, I think over like a bottle of wine, we're like, I'm really tired of this, and the other one's like, so am I. And it's like, oh, thank goodness, like we can just move on at the same time. So that all kind of was very synchronous, I guess.
So, like those early anthologies that you used to read, are there movies that have influenced your writing?
Yeah, absolutely. So many. I'm trying to think like what would be the ones that really, really jump out at me. I write a lot of body horror, so I always think of David Cronenberg's work. So The Fly, The Brood. I love those movies. I think that they're creepy and weird, and also very, especially The Fly, very emotional. I mean, you're very emotionally invested, and the body horror really plays into that emotional investment. So those are two that really jump to mind. And also, I love classic horror, so the Universal films, Hammer films. I very much grew up with those. Those were some of the earliest ones I ever saw. My dad loves the Universal horror films. His dad, my grandfather, loved them, so it was definitely something that sort of passed down the generations on the Kiste side of the family. So that's really cool, and those are really, really good memories, like Saturday morning spending time watching old horror movies.
I used to watch those old Hammer films on. They would always play them Sunday afternoons for some reason around here, and I always found that weird because like on other channels it was all Disney films and whatnot, but then you'd find these Hammer horror films, and I remember watching Dracula melt with a stake in him, like over and over again, especially like around Thanksgiving. But yeah, that's how I fell in love with those films myself.
Yeah, they were great weekend entertainment. I mean, they're great in entertainment anytime, but I feel like when you were a kid, and it's not like, it is now when you have so much entertainment at your fingertips, it really felt something special that it wasn't. You couldn't just watch it anytime. So it was this moment, you had to catch it. So. Yeah.
And I have to say, The Fly, that movie really disturbed me as a child.
Oh, I love Brundlefly.
Brundlefly. It's interesting because I didn't see that one until I was older. I had seen the original The Fly when I was a kid, and I actually don't like it. And I know, I feel like I shouldn't say that because I know a lot of people love it, and it's sort of like a sacred horror film to a lot of people, but it didn't do anything for me. And then I didn't see the remake, I think, until I was in my 20s. And late 20s, I think, maybe even my early 30s. I can't remember now, but I remember it wasn't that long ago, and I just loved it. I loved it so much. I had seen some of Cronenberg's other work when I was younger, and it had always gotten under my skin. And then The Fly was just like, it's terrifying, but it's so devastating too. And I think that they very much worked with the fact that Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis were a couple at that time. It really feels like a very natural relationship, and that worked so well to make it even more devastating, I think.
So what was the kernel that made you change from writing screenplays and trying to make movies to, you know what, I'm gonna try to write short stories and fiction?
Like I said, I had written fiction when I was younger, and I think I've said this elsewhere. I was concerned that I wasn't going to be able to deal with the rejection of going into slush piles and being told no all the time. But after I had really burned myself out on filmmaking, I'm like, I can handle the rejection, I think. And it turned out I could. Like, I was not very good at handling rejection when I was younger. So I think that it probably was good that I just kind of went off on my own to do my own stories through films for a while and kind of figure out where I was as a storyteller, and then came back to this and was happy. I'm happy that I don't take it too hard. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I've got my abandoned horse farm. I can go out back and just scream. Nobody cares. It's an abandoned horse farm. So.
Yeah. Now, you write, like, I've been reading the hell out of you lately, and I find that you write beautifully. Like, your prose is beautiful, and just your relationships in the story are really, they're intense. And I find that you write very beautifully about friendships in your fiction, and, not just friendships, but like family relations and whatnot. So I'm guessing that you probably had some close friends growing up.
I did, because you sent me these questions ahead of time, and I was looking at that, and I'm thinking, yeah, I guess so. But I think in some ways, like I did have several close friends, so I can't say no. But I think at other times, I'm an only child, and I think sometimes we look for those kind of friendships in life, and sometimes I think, it's something that can be elusive sometimes, and definitely at different points, because even some of my friends that I did have growing up, I still talk to my best friend that I had, that I met on the first day of 4th grade, but we don't talk all the time, and she's moved away and moved back, and I've moved away. So it's like you lose touch with people. And so sometimes I think that my work is exploring that kind of those gaps in relationships, or that kind of loneliness when maybe you don't have those close friendships, or when those close friendships end and how painful that can be. So kind of working with those ideas.
speaking of friendships ending and how painful that can be, which it can be, a lot of your stories I've noticed had a strong sense of loss and longing. Now, I'm not trying to be too nosy here. I'm not trying to make you cry or anything like some people in interviewing positions would try to do. But I was wondering, why do these themes seem to attract you?
It's a great question. I am trying to think. I think because I grew up, I was an only child, and I was always a very strange kid. Like I said, I was into horror from the time I was really young. And being a girl in a small town who was really into horror, and I was outspoken, and I just kind of did my own thing, that could be a very lonely life at times. That could be, you get bullied, people are not always the nicest to those who are different. And I think that was something I grew up thinking a lot about. And as an adult, you still deal with it, sadly. Sometimes you hope when you're younger, oh, this will go away. It won't be so bad when I get older. But, you still deal with a lot of that kind of sense of being on the outside at times. Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of it comes from. And again, the loss of friendships, of people close to you, either because you've grown apart or family members that have passed away over the years and things like that. I think it's sad because I feel like loss is probably one of the more universal things that we all experience. I'm not sure that everybody has ever experienced joy, but almost everyone has experienced loss. So it's something that really it's relatable for a lot of people. Plus, it's horror. I love horror, and horror and loss seem to go very well together. So maybe that's part of it too.
Yeah, for sure.
Your fiction is a little difficult to classify. We're a little hesitant to call it weird fiction because there's outright horror in there. If you were to classify your fiction, what would it be?
I would say horror. If I could only pick one thing, I would say horror, maybe even quiet horror, because it's definitely not the kind of, gory or horror, which I love too, by the way. I always, whenever I say that, I never want to make it sound like, oh, that gore horror, because I love that too. It's all great. But yeah. As a writer, I do feel like mine's a little bit more on the kind of quieter side of horror. And if not horror, I would say dark fantasy. I feel like a lot of my stuff is also kind of that dark fantasy. It's got horror elements, but I also bring in fairy tale elements and those kind of feel to the work as well.
Very much so, especially in your collection of short stories.
Yeah, I mean, there's one, All the Red Apples have Withered to Gray in particular is very much a kind of dark fantasy, very much pulling from fairy tales.
And you mentioned you were a fan of Stephen King. So, I mean, he, of course, has been kind of moving into magic realism. So do you kind of play in that as well?
I do. I actually didn't know Stephen King was into that, though. Now it's interesting because I feel like I read a lot of his short stories when I was younger, and I read Carrie, and then I haven't read a lot of other things. It was almost like I left it there because my mom had read some of Stephen King's other stuff, and it's not as good as that. And so then I was almost afraid that I wouldn't like a lot of, I would go back and not enjoy the other stuff as much. So I feel like I'm one of the rare people that's kind of focused a little bit more on the early stuff and not as much on the later work. So I didn't know he was into magic realism now, which now makes me very curious. You've piqued my interest. Not that Stephen King needs my book sale, but but yeah.
Yeah,
I think he'll still appreciate it, though.
Yes. But I do love magic realism. I think that can work so well with horror. I don't think it's done a lot with horror, but I think that there's something very interesting about taking these kind of magical elements kind of for granted and then playing with those in a sort of horror setting. I feel like that can be very interesting when it's done effectively. I don't know that I would necessarily say this about her work, but Angela Carter comes to mind when I think of that, the stories from The Bloody Chamber. I don't know that I'd say those are necessarily magic realism, but they a little bit are. And there's definitely horror and then also fairy tale and dark fantasy kind of all wrapped up in that. And that can be really fun.
Well, horror is kind of about not being lost anyway. So I think I like that you just accept all the different kind of subgenres and just put it in because it's all horror.
Yeah, that's how I very much feel. Some people get very no. I've seen people be like, Jaws is not horror. And I'm like, there's a shark and it's attacking people.
Yeah, it's a monster story, basically.
it's a monster movie. I mean, again, if somebody out there is like, Jaws is not horror, that's okay. I'm not trying to push that on you. But like, I do feel, for me, I like the idea of having more things be horror than less, especially since people can be kind of mean to horror anyways. It's an outsider genre all on its own. So I'm always like, bring more into horror. That way if people are like, I don't like horror, it's like, well, do you not like this, or this? Because those are all horror. So
yeah. I love people who are like, I don't like horror. And I'm like, well, what do you like? And they're like, well, I love Stephen King. I love Dean Koontz.
Right.
Walking Dead is awesome. It's like, well, wait.
Silence of the Lambs is my favorite movie.
Exactly. And I've heard that too. Like, oh, Silence of the Lambs isn't horror. I'm like, yeah, it is. But okay, that's fine.
We'll
if that's what somebody has to feel.
It's like,
that helps you sleep at night.
Exactly. It's like, get you through.
Yeah, we'll let you be wrong. It's okay.
Now, were you surprised when the HWA nominated your collection and Her Smile Will Untether the Universe for a Bram Stoker Award?
Yes, I was. I was very, very excited. I'm still excited about it. Sometimes I still go and double check and I'm like, yeah, that still happened, because that was very exciting, because that was my very first book. Like, I hadn't had, a standalone of my work up until that point. So for it to be nominated, I'd known of the Stokers since I was a teenager. So that was very exciting and a very big honor. I've said to people though, then it feels like it's something then you almost have to live up to if you get nominated for awards early on. I'm like, oh, I've gotta, keep going. I've got to do good. I've got to earn that.
Well, I think you are, but we'll get to that in a minute. Some of the stories in Untether the Universe are like mind-blowing. Like I said, I'm only halfway through, and I'm like exactly at the halfway point. But the Clawfoot Requiem, my God, that the beginning of that story is just like, oh my God, it's so strong and it's so dark. How did you come to write that story?
I just remember seeing this image of this bathtub of blood and thinking about loss and losing somebody you really love and having to live in the aftermath of something like that, and how someone could do that, and how sometimes when I think about loss, I also think about resilience and the resilience that we have as human beings and how we can get through things. But with that story, I wanted to kind of look at resilience and being able to move forward in a really terrifying way, and how someone could be like, okay, I'm going to move forward from having lost my sister in this terrible way to suicide, and move forward in this very terrifying kind of grotesque way. And so that was really where I started with that, and this thought of like, what would that even be like? And going through the ideas of how gross it actually is. It's kind of like more of a gross out story. I say, I'm like, oh, I don't really do gore, but literally there's an entire bathtub of blood that just decays in that story. So I guess that's pretty gory, right?
Yeah, I would say that's probably the goriest thing I've read from you so far. And but it packs a punch in what it's supposed to convey. And well,
that is
that loss.
Thank you.
Like that beginning paragraph, though, I had to put the book down for a moment after reading like 3 or 4 paragraphs, and I was just like, whoa, what did I just read?
That's an interesting one, because I remember when I first sent it out, I think it got rejected several times, and I'm like, okay, maybe it just doesn't work as a story. I mean, I didn't know. It was one of the earliest stories I wrote to try to, send out for publication. And I thought, I like it, but maybe it's not working. And then I remember sending it to Lamplight, which I love Lamplight, and Jacob Haddon, the editor there, is amazing. And Catherine Grant is an editor there now as well. And they're both incredible. And I remember sending it to Jacob at the time, and he was like, yes, this is great. And I was like, okay, maybe this does work. And then, yeah, a few people have responded. And like you said today, even that opening paragraph or the first few paragraphs, and that makes me happy. I'm glad that it still works for readers, because you never know. Like I said, you send stuff out as a writer and you don't know what's going to work for people and what's not going to work. So it's always nice to hear that it's effective.
Yeah. Now, The Man in the Ambry, that story reminded me of more older classical ghost stories. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Although the one thing I like about your writing is that you have this ambiguity going on in a lot of your stories, and The Man in the Amber isn't any different. You don't really know exactly what's going on. Like, where did this person come from? But one thing I like about ambiguity is that it's immersive for the reader. It involves them, and some readers don't like that, though. They want everything explained for them. Now, considering a lot of yours that I've read, as I just said, hold that mystery or ambiguity, I was wondering if you get any negative feedback regarding this.
Every once in a while, I'll see a reader say in a review something to that effect. And yeah, I've talked to other authors about that. I feel like the consensus and what I've heard from other people is that there are some people that like that, like you said, and then some people are like, no. And it kind of is that place with weird fiction that can be that weird fiction, you very often don't explain every single thing. And I think some people like to have things explained. So maybe that element of the weird might not be quite for them, which is obviously fine, if that's not your thing. And what's interesting is when I was younger, I didn't like more ambiguous stories. I'm like, I want this explained. I want it explained. And then I just feel like my tastes have changed over time. And now I like having that ambiguity and having those places where you're not quite sure. And you either have to decide for yourself, or sometimes I'll read something and I won't even decide. I'll be like, it could be this, it could be that. I'm okay with whatever it is because I liked that particular journey. And so I have gotten some feedback, but definitely nothing that jumps out at me as being anything more than just a difference in taste. Most of the time it's like, I would have liked to know a little bit more about that. And I always think like, yeah, and I sometimes I almost want to reach out and be like, well, here's what I was thinking about it when I wrote it. And I'm like, no, don't do that. Don't ever respond to reviews. I know not to, but every once in a while I'm like, well, I mean, I could tell you what I was thinking if you really want to know.
I find that ambiguity is really tough to get right, but I think honestly you handle it perfectly. Despite what you just said, I feel like the answers are all there. You just need to think about it, maybe even reread it. And but the more you think about what's going on in your stories, the more unsettling it feels. Now, I was wondering, when you're writing, how do you figure out what information you're going to let the reader in on? And what do you let them try and figure out for themselves in order to achieve this?
That's a great question. I really like that because I feel like it does shift with every story. And sometimes it depends on this particular story in the draft, because some drafts, the initial one that I'll write, it will explain things more. And then I'm like, no, maybe dial that back a little bit. Maybe pull it back because it'll be more interesting that way. And then other times it's the opposite. I'll write a story and I'll be like, this might not make sense to people if I don't give them a little bit more. And so it feels kind of like balancing through different drafts as to figure out exactly, where to end up with that. I remember The Man in the Amber, one piece of ambiguity that I did take out early on was there's a cat in it. I feel like I can talk about this because spoiler for The Man in the Amber, but there's a cat in The Man in the Amber that disappears into this amber where this creature is living. And I remember being like, okay, I want to make sure that people know the cat's still like kind of in there a little bit later on down the road in the story, because it is a creature living in an amber, and I was scared that people might think that the creature ate the cat. I kept thinking of the show Alf. And I'm like, no. Like, I don't want anyone to think that the creature ate the cat, because that would be a very different story. Yeah. And so I remember, like, in a later draft, adding a detail that, like, the cat would have been, like, way past the age of a normal cat, but the cat was still in there, meaning there's something supernatural going on, and the cat is fine, everyone. Yeah. The cat is not a ghost cat. It's not a ghost cat because the creature ate the cat.
It wasn't eaten. It was not eaten.
That would be such a different story, especially with the way the story ends.
Yeah, definitely.
So that was a piece of information. Like, I'm going to be really, really specific with this information. The cat is fine. The cat is completely fine.
That's the title of our interview.
The cat is fine.
It's good. That's perfect.
That question sort of leads into this question, because while I was writing the first question there, I was thinking, how many drafts would you have to go through before you get that feeling that this is right?
Again, I feel like that very much depends on the story. And it's almost a terrible question right now because I'm working on something right now that I'm very angry at. And I was almost like worried coming to this interview that I'd like come into it kind of angry and you guys would be like, what is wrong with this lesbian? And I'm like, no, I'm just angry at a story. It's not you guys.
She was so angry.
A lot of times I would say probably 3 or 4 drafts, 3 or 4 really. The first draft, I edit a lot as I go. So I try so that the first draft is relatively solid in terms of some of the details, but then I like to go through definitely a second time and often a third time. And again, depending on the story, a lot more than that. It really, I'm trying to think like what stories I've had published that have gone through the most revisions. And I'm almost hesitant to say this because then I feel bad for the stories that don't work the first time. But a lot of them, I would say probably only about 3 drafts, and the ones that have taken 6 or 7 drafts to get right are never quite right. So I'm trying to think of all the stories in the collection, and I don't know that any of them took more than a handful of drafts. So maybe that means that it's taken that long. It's not working. Maybe this current story is just a jerk. It could just be a jerk.
Oh, man. Now, all the stories I've read by you so far, anyway, and I'm pretty sure it's like this for every story that you have, but they have this very original feel to them because you like to play with narrative and with your style. How do you approach each story? How do you keep it fresh?
Thank you for saying that I'm keeping them all fresh, because that's always something that I worry about, especially when I do kind of approach them. I've had stories that are a questionnaire, or there's songs that are playlists and things like that. And I always worry that it could almost become kind of like a gimmick. So it's always trying to make sure that whatever narrative device I'm using, it makes sense for that particular story. And so that's one way that I approach it. It's like, does this work for this story, or is this just something that I think would be fun, which is okay too. But I like to think like, okay, if I think this would be a fun device to use, I at least need to wait till I know that the story is kind of reflective of whatever that device is doing on the page. And I like to try to challenge myself in terms of looking at things from a different angle, or trying to come up with something that pushes me outside of my comfort zone, because I think that's when I can do some of the best writing that I've ever done, is when I force myself to be like, okay, what am I afraid of? And going back to that's something I often go back to as a horror writer. What are my fears, and how can I explore that through a story? And the big thing for me is like a loss of identity. Again, loss, and the loss of who you are, and that comes across in a lot of my fiction.
Yeah. Now, you grew up in a small town in Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
The characters, though, in the Rust Maidens, they're a group of young women who grew up in the decaying industrial part of Cleveland, as part of the Rust Belt. Now, was Cleveland close to where you grew up, and are there any similarities between your own childhood and that of Phoebe Shaw's?
I grew up about a 90-minute drive from Cleveland, and we did go there. We went there a fair number of times when I was young. So I definitely knew the city, and I've kind of seen it change. And then I went to college in Cleveland at Case Western Reserve, which is actually talked about a little bit in the book. Not a lot, but it's kind of like a nod to my college. And there are definitely similarities. I feel like growing up in the Rust Belt, that can just kind of naturally happen. And a lot of people that I've known, family members and friends' dads have worked in steel mills. So it's like there were still some of them open when I was growing up, and I've seen them, slowly close over the years. And so that's kind of been like an ongoing thing, even though the book takes place in 1980. It's definitely been kind of a very slow, closing of a lot of these places, and not a lot to replace it in certain areas. Not a lot of new jobs, and how things do decay very much in some of these areas. And, in Cleveland, it's very, very urban area, but where I grew up wasn't as urban, and yet there were a lot of people that still worked in other factories and steel mills that have closed. So it's definitely something that's affected people kind of across the board and in all different areas. It's not just a problem in the city or more kind of rural areas. It's sort of all over. So I feel like that's something that definitely I saw growing up.
Very cool. Now, there is so much, at least this novel, Rust Maidens, really comes off as very, very true. There's so much symbolism in it, too, especially with what happens to the Rust Maidens. I truly think, honestly, that this book would do really well being taught in high schools, because there's a lot of history here, there's a lot of symbolism, but I really like the historical aspects, too, of unions and industrial battles that we saw taking place in the, the 70s and the 80s. There's just so much happening in this book. It seems like it should be like 500-600 pages. But I have to wonder, what was the research like for this one?
I actually love researching, so that was like a really, really fun part of the book. Even though some of the research, again, is so much about things that hurt so many people. But I also tried to bring out things that were like looking at the food of the time, looking at old flyers from like Sears or J.C. Penney, and really trying to kind of immerse myself in some of the things that weren't the real sad parts, or the parts where it's like, hey, look, the 70s were when we really poisoned the environment, and we're really paying for that still now. Because that also plays into it, and how much, the water was poisoned, and Lake Erie would the Cuyahoga River would catch on fire, because that was something my dad was like, remember, it was not technically Lake Erie, it was the river. I'm like, yes, it's the burning river, that's right. So, but I usually always say Lake Erie, because it's literally all right there, but it is the river that used to catch on fire. And and so I liked the researching part of it, because it did give me a chance to kind of immerse myself in that time, and really look at how things have changed and how things are very much the same. And I remember literally I was still researching just like little details here and there right up until the very last draft, because if I could get something else to put in there, like that was so much fun. So, and some of the details are very very specific, because like there's even baseball schedules. I even went as far as to look up like the Cleveland Indian baseball schedule to make sure that all of those details were exactly right as to which games were being lost or played wherever. The Cleveland Indians lost a lot that year, as I think they are very often want to do. So it was a difficult season. But so it was a lot of very specific things, and knowing exactly what was going on that day in history, and trying to at least have that much of it based in reality.
That was like one of my favorite things about this book, is that every time I went to go read it, I was suddenly in Cleveland, and not every author can accomplish this. I mean, I could almost smell the streets and see what everything looked like. It was just beautifully written. My God. Now, there's also some really good scary scenes. Like, I don't think this is a spoiler, because I'm not going too deep here about what happens. But there's a scene where our hero gets stuck in a mansion, and it's just so very creepy. How do you create scenes that will actually scare the reader?
That's a hard one, because I feel like, one, you don't know what's going to scare every individual reader, and what will scare one person won't necessarily scare another. So one, I'm just very glad that you found that particular scene scary, because that's kind of one of the centerpiece kind of scare moments in the book. That scene in particular, and again, I don't want to give too much away, because that book's still relatively new. I really wanted to create it. Not only was the environment scary, it was also what was going on, and there was a very much an emotional investment of the characters wanting to go in there. So it's not that there's anything wrong with the story that you just go into the haunted house, but if you're going into the haunted house because somebody you care about is in there, or because you have to get somebody out, or there's something, there's some reason, and that there's that emotional investment on top of it. For me as a reader or a viewer of films, that will get me more invested. That will make it so it's more terrifying, because the stakes are higher. It's not just you're randomly wandering into a haunted house. It's that there's a reason. You can't avoid it. Not if you want to do right by somebody you care about, or yourself, or whatever the particular investment is in that situation. So that is one thing I think of. And then just what scares me, the things that crawl around in the dark, and, the shadows, and, what's out there that we can't quite explain. Even if we could turn on the lights and look right at it, you might not be able to explain it. But in particular, when it's shadowy and you can't quite reach it or figure out what it is. So that's what I often look at when I'm trying to create a scene that will hopefully scare readers.
Well, it worked for me, that's for sure. Now, I mentioned Black Static magazine earlier. With them, you published the short story, Songs to Help You Cope, When Your Mom Won't Stop Haunting You and Your Friends. Now, this is related to the Rust Maidens. Which story came first, this one or the novel?
The short story definitely did. So I was actually in the middle of writing my novella, Pretty Mary's All in a Row, and I had gotten stuck kind of halfway through, and I just wanted to take a break from it so I could go back into it. And I actually was like, okay, I'm going to go try to write a short story just to let myself kind of decompress. And then I ended up getting lost in research for a few days on Songs to Help You Cope, which is also set in Cleveland in 1980. It's actually the exact same year and everything. And I just realized how much I was really enjoying researching Cleveland, and I was learning a lot of things. And it just was this time period that story's a little less kind of typically scary. It's much more of a dark fantasy story. It's just about a girl coping with this ghost of her mother that will not go away, and trying to be like, dealing with that along with everything else that goes with being a teenager. And I thought this setting is was so interesting to me, again, growing up in the Rust Belt. And I thought it would be really fun to do something else with it. And at the same time, I had been wanting to write a body horror novel that would have, these transformations of these girls. And I couldn't figure out what to do with it that I hadn't already done or hadn't already seen done with body horror, because a lot has been done with body horror, and a lot of great stuff has been. And I didn't want to just kind of retread the same thing. And I thought, I could take body horror and actually take the environment of Cleveland during that era and have it be that decay, the broken glass, the rusted metal, the poisoned water, and, incorporate that into the body transformations, and then be able to use some of the things that I had researched for Songs to Help You Cope. And that's basically, how it happened. And then after I was done with that short story, I went back and I was completely ready to finish writing Pretty Mary's All in a Row. So that worked out, and then I got the novel out of it. So that short story ended up really being good. Basically, I got two books out of that one short story. So awesome. I feel like I should send it a fruitcake or something. Thank you, story.
I like that. Here's a fruitcake. Thank you.
Thank you.
I really love the song choices that you put between the story breaks in that one. Are those the type of songs you listen to? And you mentioned playlists earlier, Spotify playlists, I think you said. Do you listen to music while writing?
I do listen to music while writing. I don't really listen to Spotify very much. I don't know that I said that, but it's actually funny you bring it up, because somebody was just being like, you should be on Spotify. And I'm like, I don't think that I am, but I should be. This is the second time it's a sign. I should be on Spotify. That's what the universe is telling me. But I do listen to a lot of music while writing, and it really changes depending on the project. When I was writing the Rust Maidens, it was a lot of Bob Seger and Tom Petty, because they were mentioned in the actual novel. And yes, the songs from Songs to Help You Cope, that playlist, there's David Bowie in there. There's Pink Floyd. I'm trying to think. There's Bruce Springsteen, which what I love about including Bruce Springsteen is what the mother says about Bruce Springsteen in the story is that, like, she's angry because he says something about in a song about, you're a beauty, but you're not a beauty, but hey, you're all right, or something. And my mom always used to get mad at that line, just like the mom in the story. So that was totally like a nod to my mom actually being like, what the heck, Bruce Springsteen? She used to get mad when we were driving and we would hear that song. So that's very much a nod to that. Although I do actually like Bruce Springsteen. I do. Even though it almost feels
I like his older
stuff.
Yes. Yeah. Now you
exactly. I like all that stuff.
Yeah. You also mentioned in terms with Songs to Help You Cope that it helped you write Pretty Mary's All in a Row. This is a book I haven't read just yet, but I want to as soon as I possibly can. Can you tell us what it's about?
It is about the Marys of folklore. So Resurrection Mary, Bloody Mary, Mary Mary Quite Contrary, Mary Lloyd, who is from, who's like basically in the mythology or the folklore, a wassailing tradition in which people carry around this horse skull. Although in the story, she carries around the horse skull. And then Mary Mac, who's from a nursery rhyme. So it's these 5 Marys, and they're all from like folklore or nursery rhymes, and they all live together in a house, and they don't know who they are, and they're trying to sort of unravel this idea of where do they come from. And they're also, it's more dark fantasy than I would say outright horror, but there are some really, I think, fun scare scenes. I was just saying to somebody recently, I'm like, that's like more whimsical horror. I feel like there's definitely horror in Pretty Marys All in a Row, but it's sort of like a little bit more whimsical horror. But I think people who like folklore, I think will enjoy it. And I like the idea of, as I was writing it, looking at how often the name Mary is used in folklore and in these kind of urban legends. Resurrection Mary, it's one that a lot of people know, and Bloody Mary, saying her name in the mirror and everything. So I thought it would be fun to kind of bring them all together and see what would happen.
Yeah, I never thought of that myself until you were just talking about that, and I was like, wow, Mary is used an awful lot. I wonder if it's because of its religious sort of relations.
Probably. That's something that, because my husband's really into folklore, and that's something he and I have talked about. But also Jack is used a lot for guys. There's a lot of, Jack and Jill and Jack and the Beanstalk. And originally I wanted to actually have a story that would incorporate both the Marys and the Jacks. And then I'm like, I actually think that might be a little too much of like bringing too much together. But maybe someday I'll also look at the Jacks of folklore and fairy tales, because there's a lot of them too.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Now,
you have to. We're going to hold you to that.
Don't hold me to it. No.
No, don't do that, please.
Every year I'm going to bug you.
You're going to get that.
That's the Jack message. Story coming.
And then if you write it, you'll get a fruitcake.
There we go. There we go. Does anyone actually like fruitcake? That's always always a thing.
Yes.
You do, Michael?
I do, but
good for you! Yay!
I have to say, I'm sorry to tell my own story in the middle of your stories, but the first and only time I had it was in a book group when we read that Truman Capote Christmas, the fruitcake story that he wrote, and the guy heading the group brought in fruitcake for us, and it was delicious.
That is awesome. I didn't even know there was a Truman Capote fruitcake story.
That's like a children's story about coming together on Christmas and making a fruitcake. It's bizarre.
Yeah, that sounds great. I was going to say, the thing I think of with fruitcakes is there's a great old Edward Gorey picture of people throwing fruitcakes into this like giant hole. Like it's like the something like the idea of the annual, disposal of the fruitcakes, and everybody at Christmas is just throwing them into like this like chasm in the ground. So I was thinking that, but I love that there's a Truman Capote story. I'm going to have to look that up. I'm actually really excited now.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm going to have to look that up too. That's pretty wild. Oh, but right now it's February, and you know what that means. It's Women in Horror Month. Now I know I've been following you for a couple weeks now because I've become quite addicted to your writing, and so I know you've been writing a series about women horror writers on your blog, and it's called Fear and the Feminine. Now, you interview some women on this, and I think you've done some other things. Can you tell us a little more about what this project is?
Really, I think this is the third year I've done it, and I think the Fear and the Feminine was just what I called last week's blog. I don't even know if that's really what I've been calling the series. So now you make me want to call the series that, because that actually that's pretty good. That'd be a good series name for it.
It is.
But I think it's just the name I gave it for last week, because I always try to give them some kind of like alliterative name. I love alliteration way too much. But anyway, so I think this is the third year that I've done a Women in Horror Month roundtable. Awesome. That I just like, look and see who's publishing things out there, and some people that some female authors that I know, and just get them together and kind of just take stock of where they're going, what they're seeing for horror, what they're working on. I love to ask them, who are some female writers that you're reading right now, and just try to get the word out there about different authors. And maybe even I don't know, because something I always love every year is finding authors that I didn't know, or female artists, or any kind of artistic medium, and just really trying to get the word out there. Again, that's what I feel for me is what Women in Horror Month is about. So many of us say the same thing year after year, that we look forward to a point where we don't need Women in Horror Month, that's just something that will be taken for granted at some point. But as of right now, it's nice. I feel like it's a good signal boost for a lot of us, and just a good opportunity to again find different creators.
Yeah, your one interview there, I think it was part 1, introduced me to a couple of new writers, like Christina Singh. Her work of poetry, A Collection of Nightmares. I was reading that, and oh my God, that's really good stuff. And there was one more, I can't remember. I can't find it on my Kindle here, but I know I got another one. But yeah, so in all honesty, I think it's horror and science fiction where women writers are mostly, they're sort of dismissed as serious writers. Why do you think it's this way, in your opinion?
I don't know that it's only horror and science fiction. I know what you're saying. I definitely know what you're saying, but I don't know. I think some places that maybe because they had been male dominated for so long that maybe that's why there's some resistance. Though I do feel like some of that is changing, especially in short fiction. I feel like so many short fiction markets in speculative fiction, so definitely science fiction and horror, have really, really, opened up in the last few years, and really actively encouraging and inviting women to submit. And I think that's helped a lot. So I think maybe it was just the way it was, and it was very old fashioned for a long time. That's being, again, diplomatic. That's being very diplomatic. But I do think that's shifting to a large degree, and not as fast as obviously we would like for it to. But I still think that there's so many editors out there that really are actively seeking diversity, across the board. And that's great. That's great to see. So it can get discouraging sometimes. But I do try to focus on, the people who are out there really doing great work and really helping to get voices out there that, 10 years ago would not have been heard. And again, I also think that in some ways the internet and social media have equalized things a little bit, because, now female authors have the opportunity to try to get more visibility in a way that when everybody was just basically mailing in submissions, you don't know how many women were submitting even, 20 years ago to horror and science fiction markets. It may have been way more than what a lot of places, ever said. Now you can kind of see more of the visibility and being like, hey, we are out here. And it is a way of being able to get our voices heard a little bit more than maybe, 20 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. You speak of the internet being or having an influence and maybe equalizing the sexes in these genres. That's true for sure, but I don't think it's enough yet, because I also have a YouTube channel for what we like to call BookTube. I don't know if you ever heard of it.
I think so, yeah.
But so often I talk about books, and I watch a lot. I watch way too many people on YouTube talking about books. It's a problem, really. But I don't know how many times I've come across. It's been a few times at least, where somebody was reading, and I brought this question up to another guest, but you made me think of it again when you were talking about that. But I've seen a few videos where somebody's read a book by a woman horror writer, and they're like, oh, I didn't know that women write horror. Oh, wow. And I'm like, really? I've been reading for, I don't know, a long time, and I've always read female horror writers and whatnot. Yeah. But there's people out there who don't know. And that just surprises me every time. So this really does lead into my next question. What do you think that everyone who is aware of this, what do you think we can do to help educate readers that there are women who not only write horror, but they write it well, very well?
That's such a difficult question because I know that there's so many different answers to that. Again, it's encouraging markets and reading from magazines that publish women, and that helps get voices out there. It's signal boosting and sharing. It's when somebody says, "I don't know any female horror writers," which again, I'm with you on that. That I'm like, how do you not know this after all this time? But again, trying, especially, I do see people that really are asking for suggestions. Yeah. And even though I know it can be very surprising and sometimes be like, how do you not know this? Not just going on the attack as much as sometimes I know that's even my instinct. It's instead to, again, keep signal boosting, keep educating and being like, yeah, there are definitely women writers out there.
Yeah. I don't want to make it sound like I want to attack these people who are unaware. It's not their fault, and that's where I think where the problem is we got to find out, I think, where the problem lies and try to fix that. Yeah.
Yes, I agree, because I think I see people sometimes, and I understand the instinct to want to be like, how do you not know? But I never do that because I agree with you. I think that there's an underlying problem, that there's a much bigger problem in the system that anybody is not aware. So again, just continuing to try to unpack this and understand where we can continue to signal boost and continue to educate and just keep getting the word out there. I do think Women in Horror Month has helped. And I do believe that it's helped. I know some people are like, I don't feel like it's helped as much as it could. And I understand that. And that's something I really try when I do my roundtable is I don't just want to get people who I know agree with me on things. I love to have people who are like, listen, I don't think Women in Horror Month has done nearly as much as maybe I think that it has, because I want to hear all of these experiences that female authors are having, because I think that that's important too. But I do think that in some ways, just getting the word out there and again, supporting publications that do publish women and again, diversity across the board, because right now it's Women in Horror Month, but there's we should all be trying our best to read authors that are not just, like us, that all of us should be, wanting to read more diverse stories and really continuing to encourage publications that are invested in diversity and just keep going and keep supporting each other. There's a lot of support in this community. Not sometimes less than others, but I do think that there's a lot of supportive people in the writing community, and I think that can help a lot in terms of just people who are supporting each other and getting the word out.
Do you find a lot of pushback from people who maybe don't want there to be an equal or inequality between men and women?
Not personally. I've seen a lot of it just in general, kind of around here and there. And sometimes it's not as overt as maybe I think it would have been 5 or 10 years ago, but it's definitely there. And it's, it's in the way that the women can be treated. I haven't experienced a lot personally. Occasionally things will happen and you just keep going. But I've definitely had friends, and I've definitely seen other female writers deal with some things that have been very, very unfair. And so there's definitely some of that pushback out there, without a doubt. I've tried as much as I can to kind of surround myself with editors that I know are supportive of diversity. Again, like right now I'm thinking of, Nightmare and Lightspeed, the editors there, Wendy Wagner and John Joseph Adams, and how much they've really, really been devoted to diversity, and how that's really been helpful. And I know they've gotten pushback. I've seen them talk about the pushback they've gotten from having some just having diverse publication. And so that's definitely an issue. So I've definitely seen that, but personally not as much, but I'm sure it's out there. I've had a couple reviews that have been like, okay, you didn't like this because it was a female centric story. That's okay. It's not okay, but I'm not gonna argue with reviewers. That's your prerogative to say those things. So I'm going to walk away now.
I was talking to Christopher Golden for a different podcast,
mm-hmm.
and he was talking about some of the pushback he's got, because, as you probably know, he's very into diverse, putting out anthologies and whatnot with a diversity, and he was saying that he's experienced some pushback, people afraid that, the typical white male's afraid that they're people like him are trying to take away them getting published. And he was like, it has nothing to do about that, because what we're doing right here and now is we're finding these authors who never had a voice before. And he's like, if you want to be in an anthology that I'm editing, just write a good story.
Exactly. Yeah. It's surprising to me that people are that afraid of just having more voices, because that's actually better for everybody. It really is, because it's just going to open up the genre to more people, and then we'll have more fans, and then there will be more of a desire to have more anthologies and more books, and so it'll actually be better for everybody. But some people don't see it that way.
Yeah, which is unfortunate, I think, honestly.
It's very unfortunate.
Now, what advice would you give any young woman writers who are just starting out?
Just keep going, keep writing your best work, keep honing your craft, realize that things will happen, that will be upsetting, do your best to find supportive people, build a network that have people who will support you in what you're doing, and that'll help get you through. And find those publications that are, and those editors that are really devoted to what they say that they're devoted to, that they are looking for diversity, and they do want your voice. So I think that's it. Just keep writing, find your network of people that will support you and that you can support, and, look for those editors that are invested in this.
Excellent. I only have 2 more questions for you, and I promise we'll let you go. Now, the first one is there anything that you have coming out shortly that readers can look forward to?
Oh, what do I have coming out? Got some short stories coming out. I have a short story coming out in a Flame Tree press anthology. So that's like the Haunted House anthology that will be coming out. Cool. That'll be out, I think, in March. I just had a story appear in Pantheon's Gorgon Stories of Emergence. So that just came out like less than a week ago. And those are the main things. I've got some other short stories that are coming out. I'm not sure when they're coming out, so I don't want to announce those yet. But definitely some short fiction. This year's mostly going to be short fiction from me, and hopefully we're working on a novel at some point again someday.
Excellent.
Once I get this current story into shape. So the one that's making me angry.
Yeah. And where can readers find you online if they have any questions or are perhaps looking for advice?
I'm pretty active on my website. I have a blog, like we said. I do interviews there and other type of publishing news. So that's GwendolynKiste.com. And then I'm also at Facebook, so Facebook.com/Gwendolyn Kiste, and Twitter, so Twitter.com/Gwendolyn Kiste. So I'm pretty active on both Facebook and Twitter, so you can find me there, hanging around when I should be writing.
Right.
Yeah. I think we all do that. We're supposed to be creating things. There we are on Twitter or Facebook and wasting time.
It's part of the thinking process. I'm thinking.
Yes. You're letting things percolate. Yes. All right.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Gwendolyn, for coming on the show. I really had a lot of fun talking with you.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Great. So much fun.
Talking about fruitcake.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Pain has a face. Allow me to show it to you. Gentlemen, I am pain.
I see dead people. Hi, I'm Chucky. Wanna play?
When there
there is no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth.
You're licking good.
Finger chewing good.
All right, so Raw.
I don't have many notes because I just get so involved with the story. So
Yeah, you know what? I didn't take any notes. I wrote notes after I watched the movie.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's kind of rare for me. I usually jot down notes while I'm watching. But, so Raw, it came out, I believe, in 2017. And it was directed by Julia Ducournau. I'm probably butchering that name, and I apologize. And Julia also wrote the screenplay. It stars Garance Marielle. She plays Justine, the main protagonist. Ella Rumpf as her sister, Alexia. And Rabba Knight Aufella. He plays Adrian. Now, the synopsis for this film is Justine is a first-year veterinary student. Her elder sister is studying the same course at the university. Justine was raised as a strict vegetarian, or you could actually say vegan, maybe. But as part of the hazing rituals, she is forced to eat some meat, and raw at that. Initially, this has adverse effects, but she soon develops a craving for meat, particularly human flesh. All right, so you said you saw this when it first came out, when it was first released, right?
yes, yeah, and it must have been really. Oh yeah, 2017. Yeah, we're in 2019. I was gonna say it must have been really the beginning of 2017 because I feel like I watched this 2 years ago. That was 2 years ago. Yeah, I had heard about this on the circuit, you know, I'm always looking for disturbing movies and disturbing fiction. And this came up as a recommendation. And boy, did it ever fit the bill.
Yeah, for sure. You know, speaking of how nasty it is, I heard the same thing. I thought it was going to be really, really, really fucking brutal. But, I found that it had its gross out parts, but honestly, it nearly made me gag at one point too. The finger scene actually had me kind of like ready to gag, and the hair scene. I don't know why, but
the hair scene.
But it wasn't as bad for me as to say Necromantic was. Remember that movie?
Oh yes,
my
favorite director.
That movie had me gagging. Like literally, I was like, "Oh."
Well, there's a difference between those two. Where what's his name, Jörg Buttgereit, that director. I don't have the name in front of me. I'm trying to remember. You know, he goes for the gross out. It's very visually gross, but Raw, for all the scenes, I mean, it does show gross stuff. It's quieter, and it's as much psychological as it is a gross out, and that is what really got to me, because it's kind of pervasive, kind of like it's that earwig that rubs against your brain and makes you susceptible.
Yeah. You know, speaking of Necromantic, I think there may have been, and I could be wrong, but the scene was just so weird. I couldn't think of anything else but Necromantic. I think there was a nod to Necromantic in the one of the parties in Raw. There's the camera sort of slowly moving through the crowd, and you see this woman licking some dude's eyeball. And they focus on that for way too long. I couldn't look at that. I was like, oh, stop that. Stop. And but you know, there's that scene in Necromantic where she's sucking on the dead corpse's eyeball, and I thought maybe that was a reference.
That could be. I mean, this is, you know, somebody that writes and directs Raw. I'm sure she is well versed in other kind of extreme horror things. I'll tell you one thing about Raw. I am so glad that I did not go to French college, because the hazing, that is like terrorism. The first time I watched that movie, I really did think that terrorists had stormed the college and were dragging the students out. That's just beyond what I've ever seen.
You know what? I thought the same thing. I didn't think terrorists. I thought, like, a bunch of dudes wearing balaclavas were gonna, like, start butchering everyone or something. Because you're right, they rush in, they, like, throw everyone's mattresses out the window. I'm like, what the fuck is going on?
Man?
I in all honesty, I don't know if they do that there. They probably do, because, you're talking about kids in university. But it seemed a little over the top to me. It seemed a little extreme.
It seems a lot extreme, but, I don't know. I mean, that would be something interesting to find out, is how exaggerated was that? I mean, do, French hazing rituals, do they kind of... I mean, the French go kind of hardcore in everything they do. So,
yeah, that's true.
I don't know.
And, the French are well known for, they've done a lot of extreme horror movies. In fact, I think you could honestly say that they own extremism in film. Would you agree to that?
Was Martyrs French? Martyrs is French. Yeah,
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Then I completely agree. There was in the 90s, there was J-horror and everything coming out of mainly Japan, which was extraordinary. But yeah, the French do their extreme horror with passion.
Oh, yes. They certainly do, and they do not hold back. This movie, it certainly has its moments, like the finger-licking goodness scene, as I like to call it, actually almost had me gagging. It didn't, but how about we get into what the story is about a little bit. It's actually very straightforward. This girl, Justine, she goes to school. She's leaving her family for the first time ever to go to university. She's going to become a veterinarian. Seems to be a family trait of them being veterinarians or something.
It certainly does.
Because the sister's there too. I don't know what the mother did or the father, but it's hard to tell. And I thought that was odd, considering the ending. I'm not going to spoil it, but the ending sort of suggests something, and it makes you wonder, well, if they're all veterinarians, then why the fuck are they veterinarians?
I know, right? Or maybe because that is convenient for their appetites.
Yeah.
Let's say.
Maybe. And so...
Because there is the scene with Quickly the dog after he died. There's that really nice shot. We assume that it's Justine's point of view, but, they just show him there on the table, and it's suggestive of hunger.
That's very true. Yeah. I didn't think of that, but yeah, now that you mention it, that makes sense. But so in school, as we were just talking about the hazing, that's some pretty crazy hazing that's going on, and they're also forced to eat some raw meat. I believe it was like a chicken kidney or something. And
it was a rabbit kidney.
Oh,
and that was the least of it. Honestly, I would rather just have eaten the thing rather than getting doused with blood and having to, they apparently not be able to shower for a couple weeks and throw my damn bed out the window. Yeah. What is that? Jeez, I'll eat the damn thing, but God.
Don't do the rest. Jesus.
Yeah,
I'd be like the grumpy guy. Like, what the fuck are you doing that for? Jesus.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
I'll eat the kidney, but leave my bed alone. The bed's off limits.
Yeah. And let me shower. Oh, the rash scene. That is, it's the attention to detail in this movie and all the different ways that Justine is uncomfortable and changing is very graphic. And again, it's very psychological. It's just, this movie really plays well between the psychological and the physical, just making you uncomfortable on whichever level. And of course, the music, and it's like every level that you can in this hour and a half makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah, that soundtrack was just brilliant, I thought. Very horror movie.
I looked that up. The mirror scene. That song is called "Bitchier Than Any Bitches," and it's recorded by twins Kinsey and Antha. And their first album was called Sex Tape, released in 2013, featuring, quote, songs about cocaine, sodomy, and cannibalism. So they're like really popular, I guess, actually, in certain sects.
That was the French rapping, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that was very dark. Those were very dark lyrics. Very dark.
Yes.
It was almost like horror rap, because horror rap is a thing. And
is it?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
it is.
Cool.
And,
well, this is definitely in that genre.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, Justine, she eats the kidney, and that sort of pushes her into this change. And as you were saying, it's psychological. So I'm pretty sure that it's all the changes that are going on in her life too. 'Cause she's not used to any of this. She's kind of lived a secluded life, right? And suddenly everything's changing on her, and she's changing too. And I thought this movie was kind of a brilliant little metaphor for that, of what it's like to go from one chapter of your life into another when you're not expecting, what's to come at all. And her transformation from childhood into adulthood is it's sort of represented with cannibalism.
Yeah. That is so true.
Yeah.
It was smart to do the leaving, going to college, and that is such a time of change for young people going to adulthood, because this could have been set in a number of ways at various ages, but that was a real brilliant move.
Yeah, it was. It's basically a coming of age story, I guess, but a very dark one. Yeah. And
it's certainly.
There's that first beginning scene I absolutely loved. You get that wide view of that road that's leading up to the school, I think, and that car gets into an accident, and you realize that there's a person there. Now I have a question about this, because you see that scene happen again. I didn't understand exactly what happened, because you have the two sisters waiting for a car to come along, and then the older sister jumps out in front of it. And you don't see anything happen. You're looking at Justine. You're looking at her reaction to what happens. Did the older sister, did she get hit by the car too? Because if she did, that brings up a whole other a dimension of what this film is about.
No. I think that, I don't know if the older sister was taught this or not, but the older sister definitely taught the younger sister how to make a car get into an accident, and then you kind of have a free meal because of the injuries. I'm assuming that the first scene is actually the last scene of the movie.
Yeah, that could be, yeah.
Yeah.
I love how it's shot, though. Just that wide view. Nothing moves except for what's happening on the screen. There's no camera changes or whatever. It's just this wide view of a street, a car getting into an accident. And it's just beautiful, and yet something terrible is happening.
That's what I'm always calling the foreign sensibility, is that patience with the camera to just set it and let a scene, unfold.
Yeah. All right.
Movies like North by Northwest did that with the plane, and there's that beautiful opening shot of Capote, where they show that farmland, that wide shot when Capote and Harper Lee are going to meet them, and it's just, the car just slowly creeps by, no cutting, no anything. Yeah. I love that, just steady, let it play out.
It's very different style, because most movies, especially Hollywood, blockbuster films, they have a lot of edits, a lot of camera changes.
Cut every.
Yeah, they do that to keep your eyes on the screen, because every time that happens, your eyes automatically look. So there's a big change, right? And these smaller films, don't do that necessarily. They expect you to be a little more intelligent and to join in and sit down, keep your eyes on the TV, and pay the fuck attention.
Yes. I love that.
All right, so what are your final thoughts on this?
This is almost a perfect movie, I think. And again, I'll say it for the third time. It's the balance between the gore and the psychological terror of what's going on. It's very smart, and this is an easy 5 stars for me. This is the kind of movie that I like. This is what I want to see when I'm in the mood for a horror movie.
Yeah, I love this film too. There's one thing actually I forgot to mention is that why did that scene with the finger make me want to gag? Because if it was something else, if she was like mawing or chowing down on a dead dog or something, unless it was the dog's intestines and it was very vivid, I wouldn't have had the same reaction. So I was wondering, is there something in us that is like complete, like instinctual? I'm talking about something instinctual that's set in us that we cannot apprehend cannibalism. Is there an instinct about that with us, do you think?
I think that scene awoke a secret desire within you, and that's why you felt uncomfortable.
I want to eat some flesh.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
Yes. That made you uncomfortable because subconsciously you realize that that's what you want.
Yeah, honestly,
that's my
honestly, I don't think so. I mean, it's a good theory and all, but no, I was repulsed. Just like in Necromantic.
Actually, that's a much longer discussion. To be honest, I think about things like that a lot with any kind of paraphilia. Is it like, and we'll take cannibalism as an example. I think that there's like one or two options. It's either that the urge to be a cannibal, like cannibalism is an extra urge that some people have, or it's something missing inside someone, which would suggest that like some kind of survivalist urge to, you'll do whatever you can, you'll cannibalize whatever, but that's blocked. The signal is blocked. So it's either because you have an extra urge or because some little mental block is gone, which I guess actually doesn't answer your question exactly, but
I'll tell you what it does do. It kind of makes me afraid of you. I'm just joking. Don't get stuck in a deserted island with Michael.
Well, now you're never going to go to a horror convention with me.
Well, as long as we don't go hungry, we should be fine.
I brought a snack.
All right, so my rating, I'm going to give it 4 dweller heads. I really enjoyed it, but I had some trouble believing. Yeah, I had some trouble believing in the car accident scene. Just she's going to get hit. I mean, when you're running in front of a car like that, you might as well just be trying to commit suicide, in my opinion. But there's just like that little thing that bothers me. I took a star off of. I think they just had to get the car into the tree, and it's always the same tree. But other than that, it's a fantastic film. I think it represents so much, and 4 is not a bad rating. So that's where I stand.
It's not. No. It's very good.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we are going to close out the show.
Oh, it's time to say goodbye.
So that was a really good conversation we had with Gwendolyn. She has a lot of energy.
She does. She is so fun. I would think that somebody who writes the kind of fiction that she does would be like really serious and almost like distracted by like normal human conversation.
Yeah,
I mean, her writing is so brilliant. I think that she'd be above mere conversation, but she's really down to earth and fun. I loved her.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking to her. And I hope you guys did too. If you guys enjoyed what you heard here, please feel free to go and give us a rating and a review on iTunes or Stitcher. And if you want to reach out to us, you can do so. We're everywhere on the internet. You can email us at darknessdwellspodcast@mail.com. You can find us on Facebook. We have both a group and a page you can like. We're on Twitter with the handle @darkdweller74. And we have a website. And now the website is www.wheredarknessdwells.com. But that's not the name of the show. The name of the show is Darkness Dwells. Everyone seems to think we're called Where Darkness Dwells because of our address. But darknessdwells.com wasn't available at the time. And honestly, I'm thinking of changing things up again. I'm thinking of actually going to a hosting service where that will host all our episodes and then some, and maybe getting a new. Because I think you were telling me once that darknessdwells.com was available again. That was like a year ago, I think. But
I might have. I think I did say that. I'm still petitioning Twitter to get @DarknessDwells for us, because the person that has that doesn't do anything.
Yeah, and that's just evil.
Give us our Twitter handle, please.
Yeah, let us be official.
Come on.
All right, so thanks for listening, everyone, and we have some good shows coming up. So pay attention and keep listening, and we will catch you next time.
Stay dark, my friends, but don't stay hungry.
Just don't try not to be hungry, and if you do get hungry, stay away from the human flesh. Michael.
Hungry.